Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine, and we're also looking at ongoing world events such as the recent presidential election here in the ununited states. Now, the war continues. The Pokrovsk salient, in which, if you look just to the southeast of Pokrovsk, remember originally this was a much more narrower salient for the Russians. That has obviously expanded. And what is eventually going to happen now is that the area around Volhodar, both to the north and northwest of Volhodar, you can see that Ukrainian forces are now being enveloped in and around the town of Kharkova. We anticipate that this will eventually collapse, and you will see the Volhodar front merge with the actual Pokrovsk salient, becoming one large, in fact, continuous offensive line in the area of the Donbas. Now, let's go back and look at what has happened over the course of the last several days. And you can clearly see the operations near Volodar were significant in terms of capture of Volodar and then loss of territory after the seizure of that fortified outpost. Now let's fast forward, and you, the viewer, can exactly see what has quickly happened. The collapse of that front, creating this envelopment operation that is now underway by Russian forces, and we anticipate, again, one continuous line to the south of Pokrovsk. Now, we're continuing to see very heavy fighting elsewhere as well. There continues to be heavy fighting taking place in Torsk. There continues to be very, very heavy fighting taking place, and that will continue in the Kursk Oblast as Ukrainian troops continue to be surrounded. There continues to be reports of North Korean troops, North Korean commandos, and paratroopers that are operating in this area with Russian naval infantry forces. And we're going to continue to watch that very, very carefully. Now, in the news, the headlines are as follows, and this is very interesting. Zelensky spurns Donald Trump's alleged peace plan. Now, I am not so certain the Russians would even accept the Donald Trump peace proposal. That essentially calls for the freezing of the conflict, an armistice, and a reduction in hostilities. It also possibly calls for the deployment of foreign forces in a demilitarized zone, and I think the Russians would have a big issue with any sort of European forces being deployed, especially Western European forces, aka forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, deployed in this area. But the big issue for the Ukrainians is the spigot is about to be cut off. The spigot that fuels the Ukrainian war machine, that gives Volodymyr Zelensky, the ability to pay his military. It gives him the ability to pay political cronies and continue basic state functions. That spigot is going to be shut down. The United States, under a Donald Trump administration, is not going to continue to supply the Ukrainian state with unlimited funding. And as we speak right now, another $6 billion are going to be sent to the Ukrainian state before Joseph Biden leaves office. So big changes. So even if Zelensky declares that he does not accept any sort of armistice and doesn't want to proceed down this Trump pathway to peace, which, again, quite frankly, I don't even believe the Russians would be okay with that themselves. I think the Russians fully understand that if the spigot is cut off, the funding spigot, okay, if that ends, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainian military to continue operations. Even now, with the spigot about halfway turned on, it is having a great deal of difficulty in dealing with the Russian Donbas offensive, and that's going to continue. The size and scope of Russian offensive operations continues to increase. We are seeing a net positive in month-over-month increases in the use of kamikaze drones. That continues to increase in terms of kamikaze drone strikes against Ukrainian forces, as there's an increase in the use of Russian GLONASS guided bombs against Ukrainian targets as well. The Russian military continues to expand. The research and development of new weapon systems to counter Western weapon systems continues to expand. Now, if this was 2.5 years ago, I would think that the Russians may have a different outlook on this Trump pathway to peace. Unfortunately, a lot has happened. A lot has happened to change the Russian mindset right now, possibly not just looking at seizing the territory that it currently has, but I believe at this point the Russian state is asking the question, can we deal with any Ukrainian entity that exists? Because look, the Russians are not just looking at the current political landscape for the next 4 years. That is small change for the Russians. The Russians are thinking to themselves, okay, so what does the Ukraine look like 8 years from now? What does it look like 14 years from now? 16 years from now? And the answer to that, based on the pendulum of the U.S. body politic, is unknown. And it's a risk. A very great risk, the way this war has been prosecuted by the Ukrainians, by the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, against the Russian Federation. So the Russians have to ask themselves, do we freeze the conflict? And in 4 years, 8 years, another unitary one-party state regime takes control in the United States and suddenly decides that they want to start re-interfering with the internal affairs of the Russian Federation. And will they then use what remains of the Ukrainian state in conjunction with NATO as a means to continue operations against Russia? That is the Russian perception. Doesn't mean it's reality, but for the Russians, it is their reality. So if the Russians right now are gravitating towards a total victory, if the Russian calculation is, yes, it will be costly, but in approximately 1 year and 6 months, 1 year and 9 months, we can completely annihilate the current Ukrainian state and replace it, then should we do that? I would say the cost versus the benefit for Russia, the benefit is higher in terms of proceeding with the conflict and destroying the Ukrainian military and the current Ukrainian state. So at the end of the day, will the Russians look at the Trump peace proposal and possibly accept it? Probably not. Most likely not. And Volodymyr Zelensky, it doesn't really matter what he says at this point, because again, when the spigot is shut off, it's going to end. It's going to end anyways, even with the spigot on. It's going to end. It's just going to happen much more quicker now, in all probability, that Trump is in office. And again, think about it. I mean, it's completely reasonable. I mean, why should the United States continue to pump funding into the Ukraine when eventually the outcome is going to be the same? It's just going to be much more costly. Versus shutting the spigot off now, it ends at some point. Maybe it takes 6 months less. But based on what's happening and what has happened, I don't think the Russians are going to allow a Ukrainian state to continue to exist. I don't. I could be wrong. I may be right. We will see. Obviously, thanks for joining us. As always, have a good day.